Vertigo. Donald Spoto calls the film Hitchcock's great masterpiece, and Robin Wood calls it Hitchcock's masterpiece to date, and one of the 4 or 5 most profound and beautiful films the cinema has yet given us. And as I have noted, the most recent of the Sight and Sound polls, which is essentially a poll of about 850 critics, programmers, academics, and distributors, really one of the most prestigious body of people who know about film. So this group of people declared a couple of years ago that Vertigo was the number one greatest film of all time, displacing Citizen Kane, which had topped the list for many years. But Vertigo was a film that was initially quite poorly received by critics, and it didn't do all that well at the box office either. Not super terribly, but not really well. So, one thing that I'd encourage you to keep reflecting on is why the film was so poorly received at the time, and then why it has since risen to such acclaim so many years later. And then I'd also encourage you to keep reflecting on your own responses to the film, knowing what you know so far about Hitchcock, and knowing, as we've seen with all his films so far in the quarter, that there's always more beneath the immediate surface of his films. And they frequently take rewatches as well as deeper thinking in order to see all the layers. I think it's worth, as we begin this discussion, thinking about the significance of the opening a little bit. The films of any film's opening and closing is are often illuminating, setting up and offering a final word on some of a film's themes and ideas. So in the opening here, we start with just this image of hands grasping, kind of disembodied hands. Then there's a rooftop chase, there's a fall. Then Scotty, whose name we don't know yet, we see him hanging, and then a policeman trying to help him, then a scream and a fall. Then there's a shot down to the ground of the dead policeman, and then we have Scotty hanging again, and there's a cut to the next scene. It is interesting to note that we never actually see how Scotty's rescued. We never see him pulling himself off the ledge, we never see him receiving help. And really, from a practical standpoint, there's almost no conceivable way that he can escape from that position. Robin Wood points out in his really great essay on the film, we are left with this impression, because we never see him being rescued, that he's dangling from the roof for the entire film in a way, almost metaphorically hanging over an abyss. The structure of the film, as was pointed out in particularly in this photo reading, is really interesting too. There are some parallel moments in the film that seem quite striking. There are these 3 screams punctuated by 3 falls. So we have that scream and the fall at the opening with the policeman. Then we have a scream and a fall in the middle with Madeline's suicide or apparent suicide. Then we have the scream and the fall at the closing, Judy's fall, so that the film is punctuated by these screams of terror and these falls. In terms of the structure too, that's it's quite interesting. There's this prologue that we could say, and then maybe 3 main acts or movements. So in the prologue, we get what we were just describing, this incident that precipitates Scotty's vertigo, and we're left with the impression of a man dangling over an abyss from that opening scene. Then in Act One, we have Scotty consenting to watch Madeline, or being seduced maybe into watching Madeline. He follows her, and then there's this gradual kind of deepening of emotional involvement and interest on Scotty's part. Then in Act Two, we could say perhaps starts with Madeline's suicide attempt or apparent suicide attempt, and that first meeting between Scotty and Madeline. And then there's this developing relationship until her death, and then his breakdown, which we could say ends maybe Act Two. Then Act Three, I think we could say, begins essentially with the meeting of Judy, the development of their relationship, and then we have a Scotty's attempted recreation of Madeline, Judy's death, and then ultimately Scotty standing over the edge of an abyss again, his vertigo cured. So he's looking down into an abyss at the end, much like he was looking down into an abyss in the beginning. But at this point at the end, it's not the height that he's afraid of, really. After that prologue, we learn pretty quickly that Scotty has vertigo, and it was brought on by the experience in that opening scene that we just saw. But it is useful to define vertigo because, again, after we've kind of seen the acts being kind of punctuated by vertigo and this idea of screams and falls throughout, and the film's opening and closing being punctuated by the sense of vertigo or someone hanging over an abyss, defining vertigo is useful. Spoto calls it a fear of falling and a desire to fall at the same time, a bit like the experience many of you maybe have had, like I have, where if you're sort of standing on the edge of something high, maybe a cliff on a hike or a building, there is this strange desire to jump, or at least maybe you'll wonder what it's like to fall. And you even have that sensation of being worried that you might jump even though you don't want to jump. Um, and Wood says that psychologists, the sort of clinical definition of vertigo is it arises from the tension between a desire to fall and a dread of falling. So that's quite an there's that and that tension and that idea I think runs through the film. And of course we get that really cool camera action that I noted in the introduction to the film, where that Hitchcock invented, this dolly zoom, where it mimics the exact thing that we're talking about with the vertigo. So you have this falling moving forward, or the zoom forward, and then you have the falling moving backward, or this tracking backward movement of the camera. Now, the implications of vertigo in terms of Scotty's character and the overall film, I think, point to an inherent tension within the film. There's this longing for risk, and there's a fear of loss. And then there's a desire for death and a terror of death. And the film is punctuated by death and by people kind of suspended between life and death, either literally or metaphorically. So it's something to keep kind of thinking about as you're reflecting on the film. Now, the first major scene after the prologue, we get this introduction to Midge, who's such an interesting character, and an introduction to her relationship with Scotty. I think just from this initial scene where we really get the chance to meet both of them. It's interesting to consider what's revealed about each of them. With Midge, we discover that she's this seemingly unromantic, quite practical, realistic, emancipated, eminently sane person. She seems to be quite positive and healthy in her outlook. But there are some inadequacies or problems that are hinted at with her. For example, she is a trained artist, but she's sketching ads. So it seems like maybe she has artistic ambitions, and yet all she's doing is marketing. She is a person who seems to be devoid of mystery or reserve, and everything's very matter of fact, but there is this depth of feeling that we glimpse in her, even just through some of the facial expressions and the way that the camera lets us note her reactions to certain things. And those brief glimpses are kind of at odds with her apparent openness and her apartment and her style. And we do get the intimation that she seems to be in love with Scotty, and she knows it, but she knows that he doesn't know it, or he's that pretty clueless about it. Scotty is also quite interesting in this scene. We see him balancing his cane, and then when it falls, he complains, quote, "It's this damned corset or this darned corset. It binds." So his cane falls. So there's like a literal failure in his action to balance something. And he links that to something that's normally thought of as feminine. He blames it on the corset that he's wearing. So if you think about where he is, he's experienced this failure in his role as a police officer, and now he's feeling a very enforced passivity, much like LB Jeffries that we saw in Rear Window. And it is a passivity that he perhaps is consciously or unconsciously associating with femininity. And we realize that Scotty feels rather emasculated. And ultimately at the end of this scene, he can't even stand on a stool, and he falls into the arms of a woman. He falls into Midge's arms. Now, for many men, and perhaps for Scotty as well, this would seem humiliating. He feels weak, he's out of control, he's not a police officer anymore, he's kind of an invalid, he's vulnerable, and Midge in the scene is the one is in control, or at least she seems to be. I mean, we get these hints that she herself is quite emotionally vulnerable, but it's something that Scotty doesn't see or acknowledge. So all of this with Scotty particularly is a setup for a motivation that he might feel like he needs to take some control and to assert his masculinity. Now, one of the next scenes with Gavin Elster, this is a really interesting scene too. This is the scene, of course, where Elster explains that his wife believes she's possessed. A number of interesting things to observe about this scene. So, as this scene moves along, there is a camera shift and a blocking shift to where Elster is ultimately standing over Scotty, kind of dominating him and imposing his story about his wife. Scotty initially rejects Elster's story, is just ridiculous, but he is gradually, kind of seemingly almost against his own will, drawn into it. And in terms of how the scene is done, Scotty eventually, near the end of the scene, he goes and he sits in the very corner of the room. And almost like physically almost diminished. And Elster stands above him, almost on this kind of stage, it's like this raised platform in the room, until Scotty really has finally stopped rejecting what he's learning and he's just taking in and accepting what Elster says. It's like Elster has successfully spun a story on a stage for Scotty, and Scotty is the credulous audience. So there's a tension for Scotty between his natural skepticism and an attraction toward this fantastic, unrealistic story, which ultimately, by the end of the scene, he seems to just accept. We won't watch it right now. I'll put a link on Canvas for you, but I encourage you to watch how the scene goes. There's a really great breakdown on this video here of how Hitchcock blocks the scene, where we see how Scotty is slowly drawn into Gavin Elster's fiction. And it's much like Rope, where we saw and discussed the idea that Brandon is directing his audience. And it's much like Hitchcock does himself, of course, for us as moviegoers. But in this scene, Elster is a bit like a director putting on a show for an audience. And the audience is Scotty, and Scotty becomes drawn in almost in spite of himself. He's kind of seduced and trapped without knowing that it's even happening to him. And he will soon become a character in the story that Gavin Elster has spun for him. Now, in the very next scene, or one of the very next scenes, we see that Scotty has decided to check out Elster's wife for himself, and we get the introduction of the character of Madeline, where it's pretty clear that any of Scotty's objections to Elster's story are just gone. He does seem to be smitten from the first. So we see the first appearance of Madeline at Ernie's, this restaurant, and we are essentially in Scotty's POV. He's sitting at the bar. He gazes around the restaurant until his eyes rest on a woman. It's this long shot of a woman seated with Gavin Elster. There's romantic music. The camera moves forward towards the woman, and then there's a cut back to Scotty. Then there's a Scotty POV shot to Madeline as she gets up, and then we see this really gorgeous profile shot of Madeline. We never hear her speak, notably. So the POV is of Scotty's onto this woman, and she's this desirable remote woman. It reads as a kind of romantic fantasy, and Madeline is kind of depicted as all the more erotic because of this combination that we see in her of grace, mysteriousness, and vulnerability. I mean, she literally glides almost rather than walking. She also has no definable expression on her face. And we're perhaps immediately aware of the contrast between Madeline and Midge. Midge is this woman we see, she seems entirely known. She's real, she's a solid, she's a practical person. Madeline, by contrast, is surrounded by an aura of mystery. And she's always remote, both from Scotty and from us, particularly in this first third of the film or so. And also, you should note that Scotty has been told about her that she's a vulnerable woman. She's subject to something that she needs saving from. So there's this direct appeal to, it's in a way a direct appeal to Scotty's desire to assert power and control. And for much of the first part of the film, she is this kind of mute, half seen object of a man's romantic quest. Now, the next 15 minutes or so of the film are spent with us and Scotty just following Madeline around. And it'd be worth noting how Scotty's view of Madeline progresses, kind of relative to the moments that show us how he perceives her and how he falls her. So after the Ernie scene, we actually never go back to a point where he goes to Elster and says he agrees to follow Madeline. It's almost as if Elster isn't important anymore to Scotty. It's just Scotty's desire to see more of Madeline. We assume at some point he must have agreed to take on this job, but we don't see it. I think in part because Scotty doesn't really care about that part of it. So as he's following Madeline, we see Madeline first drive to this florist. He follows her in her car, and there's this downward spiraling movement as he's following her, and he turns and turns. And then they go into this back alley. He follows into a dark building. And then there's this really evocative POV shot of Madeline, and this love theme music comes on again. So we see her, Scotty sees her. She's this image of a woman idealized with flowers, almost as if she's in a painting or a portrait. And then the shot we're looking at right here, this is one of the most stunning shots of the film. Madeline turns. Again, we see this profile of a woman. She's not looking at us, she's just in profile. And we expect to see kind of a reverse shot of just Scotty's face. But the image of Madeline here is actually a mirror image. We're not looking in this image at Madeline herself. The shot is shows Scotty as he in the right hand side of the screen there as he's looking at Madeline's mirror image. So this mirror shot is really wonderful for a few reasons. It's an indication that Scotty's understanding of Madeline is problematic from the very outset of his investigation. The shot, as Tanya Modeleski points out, is kind of prophetic. So, despite Scotty's attempts to gain control over Madeline, Scotty will find himself repeatedly thrown back into a kind of mirroring relationship, not seeing Madeline as she is, but as he wants to see her. And his understanding of her becomes a perception of what he wants to believe her desires are. Then, as he continues to follow Madeline, we get this trip to the museum where there's another mirroring kind of image, a portrait mirroring Madeline herself. It's a seeming identification of Madeline, but of course it's a false one. Then there's the scene in the graveyard, another kind of dreamy sequence where there's this contemplation of death with flowers all around. Then we get the suicide and the rescue. And in the suicide and the rescue, we should note that a very important point that Scotty ends by almost literally claiming Madeline. So he jumps in to save her, or he thinks he's saving her, right? He brings her home. He indicates that he now has a claim over her. Notably, we should also say that he undresses her, puts her in bed, and then he indicates he has a claim over her. He says to her, quote, once you save a person's life, you're responsible for it forever. Now, Tanya Modeleski, I think, describes what she believes Hitchcock's purpose is in an interesting way. She says that his purpose is to, quote, deconstruct that this male spectator is as much deconstructed as constructed by the film. And this spectatorship reveals a fascination with femininity that throws masculine identity into question and crisis. And indeed, Scotty's obsession with Madeline drives him towards mental breakdown and a loss of self, of course. Now, once we get to know Madeline, we are more explicitly introduced into this theme of dreaming and madness or insanity. Madeline says she's afraid, that she's mad, that she's insane because she keeps identifying with Carlotta. And a major element of her discussion with Scotty in this dream, she says she has. So it's a major element of her discussion with Scotty about her dreams. So the topic of dreams and madness really run through the film. And one of the things that Spoto says, and also Hitchcock and Truffaut allude to, is the nature of this film is this hallucinatory romantic dream world. So we might consider just a few places where we see the elements of the film tying into that dreamlike quality and the hallucinatory quality. There are, of course, the really gorgeous, or maybe it's not gorgeous, but kind of unsettling color design. The red and green scheme, and then the green scheme kind of evoking ghosts, especially that bottom image there on the right, this kind of ghostliness. The entire film, as Bodo points out too, is kind of this dreamlike pursuit of an unknown person. There is this major theme of wandering in the film. Scotty and Judy reference it several times, and we see Scotty wandering in his car, of course. There are these long periods without dialogue, much like a dream. There's the theme that runs throughout the film of loss and also loss of identity. There's that moment in the McKintrick hotel where Scotty watches Madeline enter, and then he goes in to find her, and then she just essentially disappears. It's really hard to explain or understand how she got away. It's a never explained disappearance. Then there's, of course, Scotty's nightmare that seems real. Then in the world for Scotty after Madeline's death, he is clearly lost in a kind of dream reality. He sees every woman as Madeline. And in his quest for this lost Madeline, he becomes very much like the mad Carlotta in the story that the bookseller told, who this so Carlotta, if you remember, had accosted strangers in the street as she was desperately seeking for the child that had been taken from her. And we see Scotty doing the same thing, wandering around the city, repeatedly mistaking other women for Madeline, approaching them only to be bitterly disappointed by his error. And then after the Judy transformation, too, when she quote unquote becomes Madeline in the top right hand corner there, the image, there's this visual return to the carriage house. And the carriage house, when we first saw it, if you remember, was the place where Scotty had attempted to quote unquote cure Madeline's hallucination by restoring her to the real. But what happens in a kind of reverse idea here is that there's this visual return to the carriage house, but now the return is like this signal. It signals the triumph of Scotty's hallucination over the real. Madeline's death is worth thinking about too, because I think it is often a shock to most first time viewers. Robin Wood puts it this way. He says, Madeline's death plays with the audience's expectations, and no one seeing Vertigo for the first time unprepared thinks Madeline is going to die halfway through. She's the heroine of the romance, the medium through which the escape wishes are to be fulfilled. We are prepared for a happy ending or perhaps a final grand tragedy, but not for this brutal midway rupture. Robin Wood also has another interesting interpretation of a potential audience response to Madeline and to her death. He says, at this point, Madeline's evoked in us a longing for something beyond the daily reality, which is so basic to human nature. And so, with Madeline's death, we share Scotty's desolation, helplessness, even responsibility. Wood also notes that this scene that we saw by the ocean when Scotty and Madeline kiss for the first time, it evokes this romantic cinema and it plays on our expectations, something that makes her death all the more shocking. Robin Wood says, here we see lovers embracing against a background of crashing waves, an effect which crystallizes for us another aspect of the film. For many spectators, the cinema itself is a kind of a dream, an escape world in which reality can be evaded and forgotten. And then so he goes on to say that the first half of the film plays into audiences' escapist expectations. It plays on the fact that they go into the cinema in order to see, quote unquote, a hero with whom they can identify, involved in romantic wish fulfillments. And when the film ultimately does not give us that romantic wish fulfillment because Madeline dies, it's an extraordinary experience. One final comment about Midge, because Midge, in a way, is our kind of our practical center of the film, and Madeline is our fantasy. It's quite interesting, I think, that her character simply drops out of the film altogether at a certain point. We never go back to her after she leaves this mentally disordered Scotty at the hospital. And it's worth asking why Hitchcock makes this choice. Why do we never go back to Midge's character? Robin Wood puts it in a really interesting way. He says, the last shot of Midge is of the hospital corridor and then darkness. The darkness seems to swallow her. It's a unifying image of great importance. It recalls Scotty descending that bell tower stairs after Madeline's death, where the camera, pointing straight down into the well, made it look like a tunnel into which the figure moving away from the camera was disappearing. The two moments, the corridor where Midge is and the end moment after Madeline's death, draws our attention to similarity and themes. At both points, the person disappearing has failed to help or save the person he or she loves. It suggests the ultimate impossibility of getting through to someone in the deepest essentials. So that's interesting to consider, the kind of parallel between the disappearance of Midge and Scotty kind of after the loss of Madeline. We might also say that the disappearance of Midge, uh, with the disappearance of Midge, the possibility of Scotty being rooted to a rational real world disappears. Because after Midge, he finds a Madeline lookalike and tries to recover the past he'd lost, and of course descends deeper into madness. And ultimately, he's so given over to his dedication to his dream and hallucination that he drives Judy, the real Madeline, to her death. We should also note that a somewhat controversial point for some people about this film, and in Hitchcock's choice to make a change from the book. Hitchcock himself says in the Truffaut interviews, it's only at the end of the book that the reader discovers Madeline and Judy are one and the same girl. So it's kind of like the book gives you this sort of twist ending, like, haha, Judy was Madeline all along. But he chooses not to do that in the film. In the film, this reveal that Judy is Madeline happens midway through. And of course, we know then long before Scotty does, because we see it in a flashback and we see it from Judy's perspective. And we see that fake suicide and murder with Gavin Elster at the helm. Now, Hitchcock notes about this. He says, everyone was against me. Everyone around me was against this change. They all felt that the revelation should be saved for the end of the picture. Donald Spoto notes, this was a crucial mistake thought by many critics when the film was released. Why reveal the surprise ending now? Why not wait until the end? Robin Wood notes, why did Hitchcock choose to break the first law of the mystery thriller and divulge the surprise solution two-thirds of the way through the film? Our immediate reaction as audience members to the revelation is extreme disappointment. We've come to see a mystery story and now we know it all, so what's the use of the film's continuing? Why should we watch the detective laboriously discovering things that we know already? There was much popular discontent with this revelation. So, lots of people disappointed, lots of people disagreeing with Hitchcock about this. So, we should ask, why did Hitchcock reveal the surprise? Why did he seemingly go against the idea of the mystery? Now, the effect of this midway reveal of Judy as Madeline, I think, has a lot to do with a really important point about a point of view shift. So the film up until that reveal of Judy has been Scotty's story. But when Scotty leaves Judy, right before we get the kind of Judy's perspective, and we get Judy's thoughts, the camera stays with Judy by herself for the first time, and then we get this flashback and this letter that Judy writes. So without that reveal, kind of being immersed suddenly both by camera and by way of dialogue in Judy's perspective, Judy would be really inscrutable as Madeline. But now knowing the truth, when we know what Judy knows, we are constantly aware of her feelings as well as Scotty's. So the film really gains this richness and this complexity that's on the one hand, the mystery has been spoiled, but the emotional depth and the psychological depth becomes just incredibly complex and interesting. It really gains in poignancy, and it also makes this film profoundly disturbing to watch in a way that never would be if the reveal was safe for the end. So when we're in Judy's point of view, we're also in the story of this lost and exploited woman. We get hints that she's had a really rough time of it and that Gavin Elster has also exploited her, as well as being in the story of Scotty. So, and we're much more sympathetic with Judy, someone who finds herself continually negated and manipulated by the men. And our new POV then contributes as well to our increasing tendency to condemn Scotty for having, as Truffaut says, a maniac. So now in the film, once we get this Judy reveal, we're looking with Scotty and at Scotty, and we're looking with Judy and at Judy. So there's this kind of dual perspective that we are in as audience members, a kind of split, both Judy and Scotty's. And we as viewers then are ourselves torn in a kind of vertigo. We are immersed in two perspectives that are conflicting with one another. Knowing Judy is Madeline makes what Scotty is doing all the more disturbing, and that's such an important part of this film, to be disturbed by what Scotty is doing. In Scotty, we see the rejection of the life of a person in front of him, rejecting that in favor of his unattainable ideal. Judy says to him at one point, "You won't even touch me." And he doesn't. He won't touch her until she looks like Madeline, until she looks like someone she's not. So, in a way, the film is pointing out the tendency in relationships to form this kind of idealized image of another person and substitute for the reality. And the film, in so many ways, is the ultimate deconstruction of the male gaze. How one man looks at a woman in such a way that she's thoroughly dehumanized and she's desirable only in terms of his imagination of her, not in terms of what she's really like. And when she fails to meet his expectations, he feels justified in getting revenge on her and she dies. And whether he fully intended to kill her is kind of beside the point. Even before he killed her, his obsession and his kind of power over her led her in her desire really to be loved, to give up her identity, to lose who she was in order to please him. And in so doing, Scotty really facilitated her loss of identity as well as her life. Now, the final sequence is worth discussing too. Scotty's response to learning that Judy was Madeline all along is really striking, and it's all the more complex, of course, because we know Judy's perspective as well. Now, on the one hand, I think we do feel some sympathy for Scotty. I mean, he's been deceived by both by Gavin Elster and by Judy herself. But his response is, I think, nonetheless disturbing. He's enforcing her up to the bell tower. I think it's even more complicated than just him feeling like he's been deceived. Tanya Modilewski suggests that Scotty's pain at the discovery that Judy was Madeline all along results not only from the discovery that Madeline was a fraud, but from realizing that she had been made up initially by another man, a man who had rehearsed and trained her in the same way that Scotty had rehearsed and trained Judy. And this realization comes at the moment just when Scotty thought himself to be most in control of a woman. The moment he feels himself to have achieved the freedom and power that he was longing for, and that's referenced early on in the film. Gavin Elster referenced the old days when men had freedom and power, and he's been longing for that. And we saw him longing for it in the beginning when he kind of lost his job as a police officer and he was deprived of his kind of masculine pursuits and he fainted essentially in Midge's arms. So it's worth considering, I think, how much the film is about a man's rage that he feels his power was lost, that he thought he'd found a way to regain that masculinity by saving and controlling a woman, and then finding he'd been deceived by another man as well as a woman, and that actually he didn't have the power that he thought he had. It's really quite chilling, I think, when you think about it in terms of that. So Scotty's response to in this final sequence is really striking, and the last image of Scotty is also so striking and just haunting. In terms of the final image, I love the way that Robin Wood puts it. He says, "The film ends with a magnificent image of Scotty looking down from a great height to where Judy has fallen. Magnificent because it so perfectly crystallizes our complexity of response. Scotty is cured, yet his cure has destroyed at a blow both the reality and the illusion of Judy Madeline. It has made the illusion of Madeline's death real. He is cured, but empty, desolate. Triumph and tragedy are indistinguishably fused." And then one final thought from Robin Wood, who tells us why he believes this is maybe the most perfect film of Hitchcock. He says, "It's the film nearest to perfection. Its profundity is inseparable from the perfection of form. It is a perfect organism, each character, each sequence, each image illuminating every other. Form and technique here become the perfect expression of concerns both deep and universal. Hitchcock uses audience involvement as an essential aspect of the film's significance. Together with its deeply disturbing attitude to life goes a strong feeling for the value of human relationships. Hitchcock is concerned with impulses that lie deeper than individual psychology, that are inherent in the human condition."